Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Once again, wherever you might be joining us, you're welcome and thank you for being here. And I can see that we are live, so you all should be able to see and hear us. So thank you all for being here. Once again, we are here for another impactful leader session. And this time round, we have set a topic to talk about cultures by design and leading an engaged workforce. Now, this is a conversation, a topic that I definitely have been looking forward to having. It is definitely a conversation and topic very close to my heart as a practitioner, as a coach, as a consultant, but at the same time, because I'm in such a good company with both my colleagues, Csaba and Simon, to talk about this. So I just want to once again welcome everybody before I open up the space for both Csaba and Simon to introduce themselves. And just as a reminder, as always, the chat is going to be open and monitored throughout the session. So please engage with us, share your questions, share your thoughts, just to make sure that you can see and hear us. Drop us a hello, drop us where you might be joining us from, because I do know that usually people join us from all over the world. And yeah, while you all do that, I will vacate the stage for a moment and allow both Csaba and Simon reintroduce themselves. Let's go with you, Simon, since you are our guest.
Okay. No worries. Well, thank you for having me, firstly. My name's Simon Burns. My day job is working as a sales manager for Vodafone. But I guess in the capacity that I am today also, my background is I have an occupational psychology master's. Leadership and culture is something that I've studied a lot and very interested in, and also do some coaching on the side. So really looking forward to getting into the topic.
Excellent. Thank you for being here. And Csaba, a usual guest.
The usual one.
Part of the furniture.
My name is Csaba. I'm the founder of ICQ Global, the leading expert in measuring and optimizing psychological safety, motivational drivers, and cognitive diversity, the three invisible forces that make or break a team. These are the biomarkers of high-performing teams, so it makes sense to be able to measure them so we can optimize them.
Excellent, thank you. And last but not least, once again, my name is Baiba, Žiga, and I'm the founder of Impulsum, and we measure and optimize workplace cultures, team dynamics, and leadership practices. I work very closely with Csaba, and also we have worked with Simon, so we are familiar. We have seen him in action in his leadership and his team management spaces. So once again, I'm very, very excited to have this conversation because this is kind of the topic that we often talk about behind closed doors, and we have very insightful conversations. We throw stats around, we throw case studies and examples around, and we all agree that it's time to bring these conversations to mainstream, because the things that we talk about, they are important, and I think there will be a lot of value that people will be able to get out of this conversation as well. And so once again, I do invite everyone to join us in conversation, share your questions, share your thoughts, share your reflections, whether you agree or disagree with us. We are always open to hearing different perspectives. And we really do want to also learn from you as well, because I know there are a lot of people who are listening and who are joining us every week who are practitioners in the cultural intelligence space, in workplace culture space. So there's a lot of wisdom on the other side of the screen as well. And so the topic is a big one. I don't know how much we will be able to cover on today's session. And I'm pretty sure that we will have to come back for part 2, part 3, part 4. There is just so many different aspects to cover of it. But as always, I think it is worth starting with just laying a common ground to what do we actually mean by workplace culture when we say that, because as with any definition, as any term that has become mainstream, often buzzword. Different people use it in different contexts and meaning different things. And so I feel it's important just to kind of like bring ourselves, the three of us, to the same kind of like level playing field, but at the same time for everyone to kind of like understand what do we really mean when we use the term workplace culture. And so that question goes to all of you. You know, what is workplace culture to you? How do you define it in day to day?
I'm curious about the psychologist, occupational psychologist.
Should I go? Yeah, I think from my side, there's and we're probably going to talk about this a lot. There's the theoretical and the practical, right? Let's start with the practical, because I always like to kind of bring to life kind of what it means in reality. I think for me, what is culture, what is workplace culture, is how does it feel to work here? You know, what is rewarded, what is recognized, what are the things that people call out as being positive, and also, you know, who do we promote, who do we recognize in front of our peers and beyond. And that's kind of a big part. And I think we're going to get into it in kind of terms of the role of various people in terms of how that culture changes and shapes over time. But I think that for me, is from a kind of practical perspective, is what does it feel like to work here? What's the culture? I think from a more theoretical perspective, it's more about you know, you would define it as, I think, and it is defined as kind of the customs and ideas and norms of a particular group, and that could be a work group or a country or a society. But I think that there's definitely overlap between those two things in terms of, you know, what do we stand for? Who are we? What does it feel like?
I think one of the best ways of defining it is when we define what is not culture, because I think there are a lot of misunderstandings, and it turned into a really beautiful buzzword, and it's almost like a big box. If something is sensitive or you don't want to touch it, then you put it in that box. Oh, that's cultural. And then, you know, oh, don't touch it because it's going to be a problem. So culture is definitely not about the big mission statements and the values on the wall, because most of the employees don't even know them. And even if they do, they are way too abstract. And they don't realize that they have this illusion of harmony and understanding, and they use the same word, but they have very different definitions. So I think culture is more about a group habit, a norm that most people conform to. Having said that, the way you perceive it can be very different, because that's exactly what our reports show when we analyze team dynamics, that within the same environment, within the same culture, people have really different perceptions. Some people feel like they are fish in the water, others feel rejected. Obviously, we don't know what the reason is, but we know where the problem is and we know how serious it is. And because often people don't have the vocabulary and a frame of reference to talk about it, it's very difficult to find a solution, and then they solve a problem that is not the real issue. So it is true that culture is a group habit. It's a norm. But the way you perceive it and how far you are away from it, that's a very different story, because it's all relative. And our perception can be very, very different. But if something is invisible, something is intangible, then it's way too easy to ignore it, and it's very difficult to optimize it. And if you don't have the word for it, you can only think about the symptoms. And usually we notice the bad things, not the good ones. That's just human nature. And then, depending on the level of inclusion, the level of psychological safety, or I bring it up, or I'm just going to discuss it with people who are similar to me. And then we can upgrade all those assumptions to universal truth. And then it makes it very difficult, and it turns into silos. So that was a very long kind of definition or explanation. But I think culture is just a group habit. But if you look at the individuals, it can be a very different version to everybody.
Two really interesting points. So let me pick up on Csaba. And I think we've talked about these before, but one is, what does it say on the wall? What does it say on the PowerPoint slides? Who are we and what do we stand for? Those two things, because that's often determined by HR or a leadership team that say, this is what we stand for as a culture. But actually how it feels to work here can be very different to that. I'll give you a practical example. I worked for I'll leave them unnamed company, big German company. They had 10 cultural standards. One of them was simplicity. when we were talking about what do all these cultural standards mean and how do we actually integrate them within the organization, I put my hand up and said, actually, if one of our cultural standards is simplicity, why do we have 10? Because that's very difficult for people to remember and to understand and to integrate into their data. And it seems to be actually, against the principles of having 10. And, it just demonstrates, do you know what I mean, that what we're saying and what actually feels like here are two completely different things. I think that organization wasn't simple in any way, shape or form. Yeah, they decided that that's what they wanted to be, but they hadn't integrated that in any way into the processes, what we do on a day-by-day basis. And I think if you want to have connection between those two things, then they have to live and breathe in your organization. And I think that kind of alludes on to the next point around, okay, how do we measure it? How do we monitor it? How do we manage it? There's a lot of tools out there that enable organizations to measure their culture. From my studies, the one that we kind of leveraged most with was the OCAI, the Organizational Culture Assessment Instrument. And this is a way to kind of recognize what is our culture today versus what do we want it to be. And the way that tends to work is you actually survey people at different parts of the organization, including the senior leadership team, versus different levels of the hierarchy to say where are those gaps between what we think it is and what other people think it is. And then you can actually create actionable insight to move between A and B. What is it that is we want to do that takes us from where we potentially are today to where we say that we want to be. So those, whatever they are, words on the wall, how are we going to do that? How are we actually going to make that a reality? And then you're actually creating and crafting a culture that you do want, rather than just putting words on a PowerPoint deck that don't actually have much meaning.
I'm also curious, what was the answer to your question about the simplicity?
The answer to the question was, we will come back to that. It wasn't. When we talk about culture, there's 4 quadrants of the OCAI, and one of them is control. One of them is control and a hierarchical culture. And not all German companies obviously are like this, but this was a particularly hierarchical organization. Creativity and challenging the status quo and looking at new ways of doing things wasn't something, whether it was on their slides or not, I'm not sure, but it wasn't something that they wanted to do. And it's fair to say, as somebody who kind of wants to look at how do we evolve and move things forward and change, it wasn't an organization that I would say I had a large cultural fit with, and didn't end up staying working for them for very long.
I can only echo what both of you have said, kind of like going back to the definition, kind of like the culture being the way things are around here. I think everyone kind of like says that as one of the first things, just the way things are around here, the way we do things around here. What does it feel, being around here? The other, perhaps more academic, is, what already has been mentioned around kind of like the habits, the routines, the group rituals that create a shared identity within certain parameters. And an interesting definition that I have also heard in my time is the culture is the worst behavior tolerated. And I find that a very interesting one as well, because it kind of like goes back to what both of you have already alluded to. Is one thing is what we put on our walls, one thing is what we put on our PowerPoints. What have we created during one day away day as a leadership team, and then we are bringing that back to often 1,000, 10,000 people, but we are not able to contextualize what that really means, or how we are actually going to implement those things, how we're going to implement accountability to eradicate the behaviors that actually go completely against some of the cultural values that we have identified or defined as our pillars, within our culture. And so, and another thing is, within cultures, within workplace cultures, that there's kind of like one culture that everyone talks about, again, within those PowerPoint presentations or within leadership teams, but there are so many micro, smaller cultures within the organization as well. And so I also feel that, when we engage in the culture, workplace culture conversations or work, and when we only talk about the sterile, wall definitions or wall values instead of what's actually happening under this roof, we are also, in some way, I find that's very demoralizing and insulting to people, not to recognize and acknowledge the things that perhaps go completely against, and not being open when it comes to the accountability piece as well. And so I'm curious, as we have kind of, defined what culture means, and again, there are so many, different ways of how people talk about it, why both of you believe that workplace culture is critical for business success today? Why should we even be talking about this topic?
Something I kind of talk about a lot is that if you look at the reason why I think organizations don't strategically necessarily invest in this space over the long period is because of that complexity that Csaba kind of alluded to, which is, if I put X amount of money into this, what's my ROI? If you do that with a machine and you know that you're going to get 10% more productivity, then you can create a business case that says, okay, it's very easy to say we should sign off this budget because I can get some return on that investment. Principally, I firmly believe that employees are not only an organization's most important asset, but also their biggest potential differentiator in terms of being able to compete in the market. Simon Sinek talks a lot about we have access to the same resources, the same marketing materials, whatever it might be, but actually the people and how engaged they are and how much they want to fight for the cause and push things forward is likely to be a big differentiator in terms of how successful an organization can be. But back to kind of the point on investment, it's very hard to be able to say, okay, if everybody worked 10% harder or was 10% more resilient or kind of was 10% more engaged, what does that actually do to our bottom line? So I think first and foremost, you have to have from the top down a belief that is the case. And there's definitely obviously ways to prove that. There are lots of metrics, whether that be attrition, long-term sickness, absence, etc., productivity. But I think first and foremost, you need to be able to at least demonstrate in some way, shape, or form that investment is going to create an ROI and help organizations be more successful to get that investment sustained over a long period of time to actually make it work for an organization.
It's interesting to think about the ROI. I don't know if you're familiar with Gary Vaynerchuk, the angriest looking optimist. He's the one who had a weird question once. He said, what is the ROI of a mother? It's a weird question, but how do you define that? How do you measure it? You don't know exactly. But when it comes to business, you do have to do something. And, I think we are in a lucky position because at the end of the day, it's proven beyond doubt that if a team is feeling psychologically safe and motivated, and then you add cognitive diversity on top of it, that's the highest level of growth. It's proven beyond doubt. Lots of people talk about that, but making it happen, that's very different. And if you don't have the blueprint, you don't have the data, then talking about psychological safety is not going to create it. Because if we have the best practices, we have insanely smart people, if they don't care, if they're not engaged, if they don't feel safe, if they don't feel motivated, it doesn't matter what kind of processes you have, what kind of values you have on the wall, and how many ping pong tables you have in the office. It's not going to help anything. And that's exactly what the other research showed as well, that most of the employee engagement programs are entertaining, not engaging. And that's kind of crazy. Insane amount of money goes there. It's wasted. Yoga class is not going to engage people. It's going to entertain them. And out of the 90 interventions, only one had a slightly positive impact, volunteer work. But that's not exactly what you do in the office. So it makes sense to understand what people want, how you can make them feel valued and understood. Because if they don't, then they have options. Or even worse, if they don't leave and they stay. Because I used to be a very disengaged employee a long time ago, and that wasn't pretty. And I had no idea what was going on. But that was not good for the business. It wasn't good for me either. It wasn't good for anyone. There was no winner.
You make a really interesting
Simon, we lost you for a moment.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me? You hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I was
Maybe
just
it's
saying,
my
I
side,
think,
actually. Apologies.
No.
we good? Okay, perfect. I think the interesting point there is, okay, if our culture is there to drive engagement, right? We want a culture where people align to our values and our beliefs so that they're engaged to work, to drive towards whatever mission we have as an organization. Then we get into the question of, so what is engagement? Because I think again, Csaba, you're kind of touching on what it's not, right? It's not yoga classes. Maybe that's a nice to have, but that isn't driving underlying engagement. So what's your thoughts on kind of what is engagement and kind of what impact does that then have if we're going back to the metrics of business success?
Baiba? Or... Maybe she can't, yes. What does it mean to me, the engagement?
Sorry, did you hear me? I'm not sure if is it breaking up?
The question was, what does engagement mean?
No, what is engagement and how does culture impact it?
So to me, engagement is a combination of psychological safety and motivation. So that's why even in our model, that is the growth zone. It's because that's one thing that you have the knowledge, but do you want to make progress? Do you want to collaborate? Do you feel safe and motivated enough to collaborate, to contribute, to innovate? To me, that is the engagement. And nobody has to motivate me, but they created the environment where I motivate myself, where I want to make things happen. But I think that there is more to work than a paycheck. There is a purpose. And I think that is getting even more important right now because people had time to think during the COVID and they realized that, I'm not putting up with the toxic environment. I just experience freedom. But when you're in this rat race, you get used to it and you don't even notice it. And we get used to it and we don't realize how much damage it can cause. But when you step out of it, then we have a wake-up call. And I think that's exactly what happened now. And people value engagement. They don't want to waste their time. They can earn money, but they cannot get back their time. And I think it's getting even more important now.
I agree. And I think, the reason why we even are talking about employee engagement, one of the reasons is because the way we do business has fundamentally shifted, considering how we measure or how we tend to train our leaders or how we tend to address our workplace culture. And this is a stat that Csaba and I often show in our presentations as well, is that over 95% of business value today is created by people, compared to only 15 or 17% only 50 years ago. So if previously we could have just gone and upgraded our machinery or processes to create more value, then now we have to upgrade our people practices that unpin our workplace cultures and fundamentally our business success. So workplace culture is, to my mind, no longer some HR talking point or a nice to have PR initiative. It is fundamentally one of the key aspects that drive our business success and sustainability. Another thing that we talk about, when we talk about workplace cultures and kind of like the future of leadership and stuff, is Jacob Morgan's work and how he identified the 9 skills and mindsets for future. And it's interesting that 8 out of 9 skills that he identified that were fundamental to our business success were people skills, and only 1 was technology. Yet when we look at the investment between the people and culture and technology, it is absolutely skewed, and the ratio is completely through the roof. So it also kind of like talks about how we are constantly striving to engineer people out of our cultures and always be very rational and very logical about how we go about people. But people are not always logical and rational creatures, and we do have to account for that when it comes to change and when it comes to our workplace cultures. And so again, this brings us back to the point that I mentioned earlier. Then again, tech is just an enabler, but people still come first. And therefore, workplace culture should be number 1 focus for business if they want to compete in the future. And the third aspect, I think, what both of you already alluded to around kind of like the ROI piece, is that workplace culture is not necessarily understood in business terms and in business metrics. And it's still seen as something that needs to be relegated in HR or DEI or people function, whatever these functions are called these days. But it is a business topic, and it is everyone's work, not just something that HR does. Our sales depend on the quality of our leadership and our workplace cultures. We have great examples of that. The level of innovation within our organization depends on our culture. The M3 sticky notes and Google's Gmail are great examples of that. I think we're just lousy at measuring and optimizing these aspects of our business. We might be the most advanced doing that in other aspects of our business, and we might be even selling these services, externally, and yet, we are just lousy to do that internally within our own businesses. So there is just so much untapped potential that lays within our people and our workplace cultures that are fundamental to our business. So it still makes me smile that we still, need to talk about business case for our people or business case for our culture to kind of justify the value of it. And I think that still shows how we are still kind of like stuck in the way of doing things that are not value adding. And there are tons of stats that are being produced by, Gallups and other large organizations every single year that back that up. But we just... Clearly, it's not painful enough yet. And actually, the next question that I have as well, it's very, it's in line with one of the questions that's been asked in the chat as well, which I'm going to pull up, and Catherine Platt has asked that one. But I'm going to pull this comment up by Patrick. And Patrick is saying the dominant, non-dominant national culture dynamics are a large part of everything that happens. And that's a very interesting part because, again, when it comes to cultural aspects within this work and workplace culture is something that we do talk about. And I'd love for either of you to make some remarks about this comment, and I definitely know that Csaba will have a thing or two to say about this.
Go on, Csaba.
Baiba is always waiting for something controversial, something
Absolutely not.
But that's it's not happening. So I think for example, last week I had a conversation with someone and we talked about psychological safety, and the person said, "Oh, but in Asia it doesn't exist." I said, "I don't think so. I think it does. Maybe there's less awareness, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. You don't have to believe in gravity, but it still pulls you back. So if there's no psychological safety, the symptoms are exactly the same. The information is not going to flow. You're not going to get feedback. If I make a mistake, I'm going to hide it. So the outcome is exactly the same thing. Just because they don't have a word for it, is still damaging businesses. So that's not true. But at the same time, it is true that a lot of ideas and frameworks are really Western European and North American. And they make it sound like the whole world thinks like that. That's not exactly true. So I agree that national culture is important. But at the same time, if you look at, for example, hundreds of assessments, we can see that wherever you go in the world, the themes can be very different from the national culture, especially within companies. And often they are much more similar inside, because often there's an international team. And on a surface level, they should be really diverse. But in reality, their cognitive diversity is sometimes very low. A lot of different looking people who think the same way, but that's also normal, because it was a choice that I want to work for that company. I want to work in this profession. That was a choice. Your country of origin, gender, and generation were not. And that's the reason why they're the poorest container of culture. You cannot create a high-performing team based on passports, even though companies sell that idea. But if you look at up-to-date research, it makes it pretty clear that has nothing to do with science. But it's a good starting point, because wherever you go, it makes sense to learn about what people are used to, what is expected. And then when you start working with them, you interact more, then you will realize that, yeah, that's like that, or maybe it's not. And you pressure test it. For example, when we do the global disc debrief, And we always look for the friction. So which part really resonated with you? Or which one you really disliked and you said, no, that's not me. That's where the value is. You pressure test the ideas. Because when everything is nice, then we can believe in the values on the wall. But when you make your first mistake, that's when you test the idea. When you have your first success, is it yours or is it going to be taken away from you? That's when you test the culture. That's when you find out what it is. Mm-hmm. So it's a good starting point, definitely, but it's not the solution.
And culture is often, when we talk about culture, is often understood in the context, exactly as you mentioned, in the context of national culture. But exactly as you said, passports are not a valid or effective way of building workplace cultures. And we are each a container of more cultures than the average assumptions of what the nation or a country carries. So again, what we are talking about here is that kind of like cultural intelligence piece, when we actually are focusing on the needs of a person rather than squeezing the average of a whole nation into one person. Because I think rarely any of us would kind of identify as the average of our own country. But as you said, I agree. It always is a good start to start somewhere, and then it can be unpicked and picked. And Simon, did you have something to say?
I think I agree with both what you've both said. I think that obviously this has an influence, especially if a company is based in a certain market, then the likely norms and values of that country are likely to have some sort of impact on the working culture of that organization. But it doesn't have to be that way. Again, it comes down to measuring and understanding, and it's not binary, right? So the OCAI that I mentioned, it's got 4 quadrants. It's about collaborate. So how do we do things together? How do we work to doing things? Compete, which is kind of market focused, and actually how do we go and take on the competitors and win in the market. And control, which is more like that hierarchical, we have an order and a way of doing things, and that's how we follow it. And I think elements of various different country norms and values probably fit into one of those boxes. But like you're saying, Baiba, it isn't that it's one or the other. There's elements and the shades of grey with personality, with norms and values of country cultures and with working cultures. And it's then just about identifying as an organization, where do you want to sit and where do you sit today? And actually, what can you do to move between those two elements, right? If it isn't aligned to what you want it to be, then what can you do specifically from an action perspective to move it from the culture that you currently have and how people feel working here to the one that you want it to be, which is hopefully aligned to what you deem as successful for your individual business.
And I think it's a good time now to kind of like move our conversation to the next stage, which is also kind of like part of the title of this conversation is, leading an engaged workforce. So let's talk about leaders. And I'll ask you a question that I posed on the post, which I posted when I invited people to join us today. And that was, how do you know that your culture is a healthy one? Or how do you know if your culture is a healthy one? So as a leader, how do you know that?
So I think from my side, there's 2 things, right? One is from a data perspective, you can have surveys, you can ask people, you can get them to feedback, and you can look at what that looks like over time and look at trends. But kind of on the more practical side, I think it comes down to what does it feel like when you're in the office? How are my one-to-one conversations going with my team? There's 4 stages of motivation. And the 4th one is persistence, which is the hardest. It's when we run into a wall time and time again trying to get something done, and we have to keep going to try and find a way to solve that problem. And for me, that's a cue, because I think when people are truly engaged and motivated and in a culture that works for them and an environment that works for them, then they have more persistence. They will continue to do that, even when it would be easier just to give up and say, do you know what, I can't do this, hand it back to my manager, hand it back to somebody else as a problem. I think that's a very practical cue when I see people trying to find solutions to problems that are very difficult to solve, then I know that means that they're motivated, engaged, and in a culture that is kind of healthy, for you to put it in the words that you put it.
I don't know, I have a slightly different experience, because I think the less healthy the culture is, the less the leaders are aware of it. And often they assume that everything is fine. And I can tell you an example. It was, for example, last week, big German company, senior leadership team. The packaging was fantastic. We are number one, but we can be even better. So, okay, very open, excellent. And then we discussed the results, and it wasn't perfect. The pushback immediately. No, that's wrong. No, you should dismiss the highest and the lowest score. No, you're not prepared. So I created it. What do you mean I'm not prepared? I know what I'm doing. But they just completely, almost like in the US, we could see this fake news. If I like it, fantastic, then it's true. If I don't like it, that's wrong. That's just incorrect. So the disconnect between the packaging, the mission statements and the actual behavior was really huge. So the question is, do leaders want to make it work? Do they want to be aware of it? Or are they aware of it? Because often they just assume it. And I think that's the problem. And the worse it is, the less they know. And the more dangerous it is. Because they don't get all the information that could help them make the right decision. And that's the paradox of leadership as well. That under pressure, we outsource our power to an authority figure.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's no psychological safety and motivation, then we lose the power of cognitive diversity exactly when we need it the most. And we have only one perspective, the leaders. It doesn't matter how smart they are, it's still only one. And that's dangerous.
So how do you not fall into the trap of being an ignorant leader then, who thinks that everything is perfect, but actually beneath the surface, it's not? How do you kind of double check yourself to make sure that isn't you?
The problem is when somebody is doing well enough, and like Baiba said, it doesn't hurt enough, then there's not much leverage. And if people are not open to it, and they are not willing to see the yellow signs, then life is going to give them the red one soon. And that's the right timing, because that's an opportunity to do something about it. It's an opportunity to address the root cause of an issue before it becomes a real and expensive problem. If they refuse it, that's what they do. That's why my favorite saying is, I think it's Native American, that you cannot wake up somebody who is not asleep. So it's not about the lack of information, it's the lack of willingness. They are not ready for it. And maybe later, maybe something clicks when one person leaves or something goes wrong, then they realize, oh, that's exactly what we talked about. But until then, probably it's not going to happen.
Both very interesting points and very valid points. And I was thinking about it as you were both talking, and there's kind of like this, the leader aspect who works with teams, who manages teams day in, day out. And I think there's absolutely, a level of trust we need to have in our leaders and our managers, that they feel the dynamics and the air, to say, around our people, and they feel the changes when something is getting fine-tuned one way or the other. So do we trust, well, first and foremost, do we trust our leaders enough? Do we trust their gut feeling enough to be to address those concerns, early on? And the other thing I'm kind of like thinking perhaps more on more of a macro level, perhaps, is also, as a leader, one is kind of like my relationship facing the team, and the other one is kind of like my relationship or my organization's relationship as they face me. And what I mean by that is, do they continuously develop me as a leader with these values at the core of it? Do they invest in me being able to determine how my team is feeling and to improve them, so I don't always have to use my gut feelings temperature check ultimately, but that I can do it in more standardized way, and so that me as a leader, or I as a leader, have the same vocabulary and standard of maintaining a good standard of culture across the organization. And so I think that those kind of like things are also huge telling factors. And that's why, as someone who's worked in talent acquisition and kind of like in the HR function, I always say, as shiny as the presentations might be, when you hire someone, you say all the greatest things, and they ask, what does it really feel, working for this organization? Like, best thing ever. But then, there are some micro things that happen during that recruitment and interviewing process that are so telling about that culture that you often don't even need to ask that question. Do they reschedule? Do they cancel last minute? Do they don't follow up, don't give you feedback during those during that interviewing process? When they tell you you're going to meet one of the key stakeholders, they don't show up because they don't have time, they have other more important meetings and whatnot. And so even before someone has become part of our culture or part of our organization, and we are selling them this dream or this slick spiel about what our organization is, but actually how we practice it is more telling about it. So I always say that the recruitment process will tell you everything that you need to know about organization culture.
I think disaster requires teamwork as well, just like high performance.
Oh, totally.
Because
it's co-creative.
On the same notes, it's a competitor to your company, Simon, two identical letters. So we went to a shop to buy 2 phones and a broadband. We spent, I think, 5 hours in the shop because they messed up everything they could. Wrong information, we have to redo it. The manager was hiding somewhere. We see him once. And then they didn't have something in stock. They had the wrong price. And now it turned out that they don't even know about the broadband. Every single step. And it's not one person. Everybody's like the exact opposite of high-performing teams. It required teamwork. And that went back to the manager as well, because he was behind the walls for hours. Instead of dealing with the situation, no, let's not do that. And everything comes down to that. Because they set the example. And I think that's the kind of training that they got.
There's a comment that has come in from Pietra, who's saying, good that you mentioned leaders' gut feelings, because team also decides based on it. I'm not fully sure, because there's kind of like ... whether there's something kind of like left unsaid. Yeah, because I can't pull the comment up on the screen here just yet, but maybe you have a better interpretation of what Pietra may have said, or maybe Pietra, you can expand on that comment a little bit. But in terms of, again, talking about leaders and kind of like what it means, how do we know that we are building a healthy culture? What role does a leader play in shaping and maintaining workplace culture?
I think for me, it's critical, right? You talked about micro cultures and organizational cultures, and depending on the size of the organization, having those micro cultures within that broader organization. I'm from my side, I think being able to truly understand the individuals within my team so that I can try and build a environment where each of them can flourish, because they all have very different things that motivate or engage them. So the macro culture can never engage and motivate every one of those individuals, because it's broad and it has to be a macro level. So I think the role of leaders is absolutely critical to be able to distill that down and make it personable for every individual within their team. I think motivation is a really, really interesting topic that links very closely into this, but it's how do I create an environment where my people are utilizing their skills so that they're enjoying their role, so that they want to work that 10% harder, or whatever that figure might be. And that's kind of a big part of like self-determination theory, which is, what is self-motivation? People don't turn up honestly to work get paid, because at the end of the day, is a basic need. Yes, we probably aspire to earn more, and we can talk about status and kind of why we want to earn more and more money. But ultimately, when people are truly enjoying their job, it's because they're self-motivated, because they're doing something they're interested in. Whether, as Daniel Pink talks about, whether that's a small P for purpose, which is I'm evolving a skill, I'm learning something new, I'm developing myself, or whether that's a big P, which is I'm aligned to the organization's values and goals and what they believe in. Have to figure out individually what those mean for different people within the team, and then try and create work that they can focus on that enables them to feel that motivation and engagement. So I think that's the role of the leader, really kind of personalizing at a kind of individual level, which is something that you just can't do at a macro level.
I think that's a fair point, because yes, that is the role. The question is, do they have the skills to make it happen? Because most of the leaders, as I think this is what we talked about last time with Baiba as well, that 82% of managers are accidental managers, that they just got promoted, they never got the training, and they use common sense and good intention to lead and serve people. And then it backfires, because 60 to 80% of all problems go back to that. The intention is great, impact, not so much. And often I think that is the problem, that they don't have the right tools to do that. And they try their best, and that's why the potential is lost. But when you're a leader, everything is amplified. Every single word, every single action. And what's even more loud is probably all are the words that you don't say. Because when you leave too much space for assumptions, then it's going to go really wrong. Because people just assume things, and that tends to be negative. And then they start gossiping, and it goes wrong. So over-communicating is still better than waiting. So if there's a chance that people can misunderstand you as a leader, yes, then do it. Talk about it. Because at the end of the day, everything goes back to the leader. People are not naive. They can see if there's a disconnect between what you say and what you do is too big. The best option is I step back, survival mode, I get paid, and that's it. But if the words match the actions, that's fantastic. Good words, good actions.
100%. I think it comes back full circle to where we started, which is ultimately, do organizations recruit or promote people based on their leadership skills or based on what they've done as individual contributors, and do those things correlate? They don't. And then if that's the case, then are we setting ourselves up for success in terms of our ability to be able to deliver a workplace culture that enables people to be engaged and motivated? So, I think, again, I've worked with and for, from a consultancy perspective, a lot of organizations, but the one that I have seen do that very, very well is actually when they're recruiting for leadership positions. Not much of the interview is about technical capability. It's about actually the soft skills that they have and what impact that's going to have on a broader, because ultimately your role as a manager is to create something bigger than the sum of its parts. But if you don't have A, the right attitude, or B, the right skills, and I think attitude is super important, right? Because if you don't want to help people develop, if you don't want to understand people intricately, actually, I'm not sure that you can be a successful manager and deliver that objective of delivering more than some of its parts. Because if you have the same approach to every one of your team, that's not going to work, because some people just won't respond well to that. And like you said, then the response and the engagement you get from those people will be either to do less or to leave.
I think that's also the challenge, because people can learn how to speak properly, and I know what to say. And statistically, around 2% of the people are psychopaths, so they have the people skills, but not a lot of emotions. But they know what to do, and especially in leadership positions, you have a lot of those. So they know what to do, and that's why I really like. There was one, I don't know if it was an ad or recruitment campaign. It was one of the, I think, beer companies, probably in Germany, that they were testing people. They created different situations, and they wanted to see how people react, and they were filming them. Kind of creepy, but I think that was a really good test. Because you can say whatever you want, but how do you react when nobody's watching? And that's when you find out who that person is. And I thought that was brilliant. That's real. That's when you see behind the mask.
I think it's a super interesting point, right? And you think about how traditionally kind of personal development or ratings, or however organizations choose to measure their employee performance, but it's all downwards. But actually, the person who has the most impact on the team is the person upwards. But how many organizations truly gather data to recognize, okay, what do my team think about me as a manager or as a leader and how impactful I am, and B, hold me to account for that. So if I'm not delivering, which is my core responsibility to be able to motivate and engage a team to deliver, how am I then being measured or managed out of the business for not achieving that goal? But again, that kind of goes back to, if you want to truly have a people first culture, you have to integrate these kind of processes and approaches into your policies and the way that you operate. And how many organizations are genuinely doing that versus, as you were talking about, yes, I can probably tell a great story to my manager when I'm about how I'm managing my team, but is there any data that actually underpins that and proves it, or do we actually care about it, or is it just lip service?
And the same behavior can be seen as positive or negative, depending on the employees as well. And I think that's the misleading part, because maybe my leadership style was, well received by someone, but other people cannot stand me because of the same thing. And often that's the problem. That's the level of cultural intelligence. It's not about filling out a test and my cultural intelligence is off the chart. Sit down. That's not true, because the quality of our cultural intelligence and leadership skills is reflected in the impact on the people who matter the most, our team, and the results that we deliver. That's the real test. Nothing else matters. And I think this is what we have to aim for. And that's way beyond psychometric assessments and international knowledge. That's more than that.
Very interesting, very valid points. And I'm not going to take too much time because I think both of you have already said everything that perhaps I was thinking. The only thing that I want to mention, just because Simon brought it up around kind of like the leadership piece as such, and this is probably a conversation for another day. We don't have enough time for that, and maybe we'll come together for part 2 to talk about it. But it's the notion of leader or notion of leadership itself. Who has defined what that looks like and what those characteristics look? And again, I think, Csaba, you were talking about, when the mask falls, what is actually behind it. But often, when we are set these artificial standards or parameters of what leader looks like, how they talk, how they walk, how they dress, whatever it might be, how they, maintain eye contact, how they, have fine-tuned their body language and all of those kinds of things. We actually, I feel we have lost out on a lot of leaders that don't necessarily fit this mold, but actually are very, very important for the success of the organization. And, women probably, are one of that. Women are only starting to really claim their spaces around those executive tables and within organizations. I think this year is the first year when finally there are more women within a Fortune 500 CEO list than there are Johns. We have our neurodivergent, colleagues, neurodivergent folk as well, who have always been kind of like left behind the line because they are not enough of something. And so I think organizations have lost out on a lot of potential just by having very strict, inflexible parameters of what leadership and what leader actually means and what it looks like. So I really think that there is an opportunity to really expand what we mean by that. And the second thing, what Simon also was talking about, is around that behaviors, whether we only talk about self-audited behaviors, I feel I'm a great leader because of X, Y, and Z, or do we do the peer reviews and 360 reviews, and how are they used to hold people accountable? Again, we come back to kind of like that accountability piece. And we are very quickly approaching the end of our session, and I still have got tons of questions, and I feel that we haven't, really gone really to the depth of it. But I really want to bring up Catherine's question because I think it fits in here quite well. And she's asking, what small changes can we as leaders make that will make a big difference? What small changes can we make that makes a big difference?
For me, it's simple. It's truly understanding your team, what motivates them, what engages them, what are they good at, what do they like doing, what kind of environments do they like working within, and then being able to where possible, craft and create that environment for every individual, because that's when you'll get the maximum out of each of them. And that's super complicated, right? Because we also work within a macro structure that doesn't necessarily enable that. But if you have the autonomy to be able to make some of those decisions, that mean that it isn't just the policy and the process, it's actually how do I flex those for individuals within my team based on what they need and what they want, that ultimately will maximize how engaged and how motivated they are to go and do a good job for us.
I think that leaders need to get to the point where their desire to grow the business, to grow the team, and to grow the employee is stronger than the desire to protect their ego. Because until then, nothing is going to happen. And often we have this illusion that we are doing the right thing. But it goes back to the very first question. How do you know? It's such a simple question. How do you know? And most people cannot answer it. It's such a basic, fundamental question. If you ask them about the sales, then they should know the answer, because you have to know your numbers. But when it comes to culture, it comes to leadership, how do you know? There's not much science, no data. And we can see that in the plummeting employee engagement scores and skyrocketing burnout rate. So it makes sense to focus on that, to match the passion with practical science. Because guessing is not an option right now. It's getting more and more difficult to attract talent and engage the right people. It's not optional. It's not hurting enough yet, maybe, but it's going to. So being curious and then aiming for getting things right instead of being right, that's a good start. It sounds like a small change, but in reality, it can make a huge difference.
Thank you both. And there's another question that has come in from Dr. Osmani, and he's asking, what is the minimum duration someone should be associated as a leader within an organization or team to start shaping the culture? I think that's a very interesting question.
Yeah, I don't know that there's. I mean, from a micro culture perspective, when you're new into a team, I think day one, understanding what has preceded you and then kind of what you want things to look like in the future, but doing that as a mind share with the team, so that it's something that you co-create, something that is really heavily talked about in sports teams in particular, right? This sense of belonging. What do we stand for? How do we self-govern the things that we believe in, so that it's not just the leader calling things out when behaviors aren't in line with that culture, but it's something that we've created together. So I think taking the team on that journey with you, buying into what that is that we stand for, how do we behave, how do we act, what do we want to get out of this, and I think that starts from day one, and potentially it iterates over time, because as a new leader to a team, you potentially learn more about the kind of broader dynamics, especially if you're brand new to an organization. But I think it's important that you're kind of setting the ground work from day one, that this is something that you care about and you want to invest in, and that you want the team to be a part of. And then that kind of, back to your point of trust, Csaba, that demonstrates to people immediately that people are something that's really high on your agenda, and you see it as an important part of the success that you'll have as a team and ultimately an organization.
I can give an even more precise number, and that is 7 seconds. And the reason is that if you look at the psychology, then when you meet someone new, within the first 7 seconds, we form the first impression. We spend the next hour confirming it, and most people stay there. So I think that is really important, because if you walk in and then you don't look at people, or maybe you choose to shake their hands and you greet them, that makes a huge difference already. So you cannot be neutral, and this is what Timothy Clark said as well, that you cannot be neutral. You get in the way, or you design it, you shape it. And you cannot be neutral. You can, even if you turn a blind eye to something, technically, you agree to it. And especially as a leader, everything is amplified, whatever we do. So I think it's 7 seconds.
Yeah, I don't think that I've got much to add to that. Also, is that it is absolutely from the get-go, the energy that you walk into the room with, it absolutely matters. And so I know that we are absolutely running out of time. And thank you so much, everyone who's joined. us and in this conversation, and thank you for all of your comments. And I'm sorry I haven't been able to pull all of you up as part of this conversation. Arif is asking, will this conversation be available for later? Yes, absolutely. It will stay here. It will also be available on YouTube, so you can go and rewatch it at any point. But Arif is saying that this was a very eye-opening and important conversation, and it requires to be revisited again and again, which is a beautiful comment. Thank you for that. But before we depart, I do want to ask you one last question, which I think will nicely close this conversation. And I want to ask both of you, from your personal experience, what has been the most energizing and impactful workplace culture that you have been part of? What has made it that good for you?
So for me, it's, and I don't mind name checking them, because I think in a positive light, worked for Klarna for a period of time as a consultant, and then also as an employee. And for me, the way that they integrated their values into everything that they did was the way that culture lived and breathed. So, we talked about PowerPoint slides, etc., but from right across the employee life cycle, from the way that they interviewed and kind of leaned on that cultural aspect in terms of what they stood for, to the way that they performance managed, promoted, rewarded, recognized across the board. That was something that was kind of very inherent within all the processes and what the organization stood for. And outside of that as well, like how they brought people together, they're very kind of working together, and the depth of relationships. So investing in small things that, Csaba, you said kind of it doesn't define your culture, but when you invest in those in the right way with the right underlying foundations, those things also become important, right? Your ability to join your colleagues after work, do things, community things that you enjoy together. So actually there was this huge sense of belonging, that people kind of not only were colleagues but friends, and also were in for the same mission and value that the organization was working towards. So you felt very invested within that. So I think that's the company that I've seen do the best job of kind of measuring, monitoring and managing culture, and really defining what it is and implementing it well.
For me, that was, I think, 2 years ago. I was doing a consulting job for the big pharmaceutical company. And the project was about increasing decision intelligence by combining behavioral sciences, social sciences, and data and analytics. What a wonderful topic. And, it's like a 1-year project, and I felt like fish in the water. I loved it. I said, this is the environment, and I can do what I really enjoy. And even though it was hardcore sometimes, and, working with the right people creates a lot of friction as well. So often this is the misunderstanding that, it should be like Cloud9 and it's more beautiful. Like when you find the one. No, it takes work. And it has to be challenging, but that's why it's rewarding and fulfilling. And sometimes I wanted to scoop out my eyes, but the progress we made and the way we handle difficult situations, that's when you get to know someone. And I thought, wow, this is unbelievable. So once you're in the right team with the right people, there's nothing better than that. If it's not the right team, I would rather be alone.
Maybe one final thing, and this might open a can of worms that we can address another time, but my view is that not every culture is right for every individual, right? I talked before about a big German company I worked for that I hated working for because it was completely alien to me and against all my values. But that isn't to say that their culture is wrong. It was a wrong culture for me. So I truly believe that cultural fit is important. And I think companies who really invest in determining what their culture is and can market that and be clear with that, and to your point, Baiba, in their recruitment process, so you actually understand what is this company, what do they stand for, so that there's that consistency when you join, and then you are hopefully in an environment that you enjoy. For me, I want to work for companies that challenge the status quo, that are trying to innovate and drive new and fresh things. Other people would find that completely alien and hate that world, but I think the organization's responsibility is to be very A, diligent in terms of determining it, and then B, making sure it is really what it feels like to work here. And then you actually end up with people who are in an environment where they can flourish, as opposed to one where you join a company and it's completely at odds with what you want. And yeah, ultimately that's only going to end in you being disengaged or you leaving, which doesn't help anybody.
And that's such a good point that you raise, Simon, around, that culture is not necessarily always bad. It might just not be for you. And also when I think about the best experience for me within a particular organization in which I was working at for a number of years. And when I think about kind of like the best time of my career there, it wasn't these number of years. It was a particular period. So cultures are fluid, cultures change, and within the same organization we can experience some of our best moments in our career and feel the most supported. And actually there are periods when we don't recognize the culture. But at a time when it was the most energizing for me, it was when I felt I was trusted, supported, and resourced to do my work. I could exercise my skills and my talents in a way that felt authentic to me, which made me a more effective employee. It made me a more energized employee, which meant that I could be I was more productive, and I provided better service to my clients or stakeholders. And it also made me a more helpful and empathetic colleague. So it was a place, or it was a time where I felt I had agency in my own work, and I had voice in challenging status quo, to use your words, Simon, to making change and to really adding value to the business. Because at the end of the day, we are going to these organizations to, of course, be able to maintain a lifestyle and pay bills and stuff like that. But I truly do believe that people go to these workplaces to make a good impact and add value to these organizations as well. So on that note, I do really appreciate both of you staying a little bit behind, and I really appreciate to everyone who's been with us throughout this conversation. I really appreciate all of you and your comments and your questions. Thank you for taking part in this conversation. And just to remind once again, this conversation will stay here. It will also be accessible on YouTube, so you can go back and revisit it again. But I do recognize that we've only scratched the surface. So I really do hope that we will be able to come back in the same company again to continue our conversation about workplace cultures, leading engaged teams, and again, really elevating the topic of leader. So thank you both so much for your contributions. I really appreciate you taking the time out to be here this afternoon or evening. And I really look forward to seeing you both in this space again.
Thanks, Baiba.
It was a pleasure.